This is Jessica Taylor interviewing Frederick Carter on July 12th, 2013 at 10:10 a.m. Mr. Carter, can you please state your full name?
My name is Frederick R. Risden Miles, M-I-L-E-S, Carter. And
what is your date of birth?
3/6/44.
Where were you born?
In Gloucester County, over the top of the funeral home that's in the picture. In the building, upstairs over the office.
Where was the funeral home located within Gloucester?
Right where the auto parts place is in front of the hospital. We sold them. That's our development. Everything you see on the left hand, on the west side of the road.
Okay. Do you have any siblings?
I have a brother named George. He's George Nelson Carter Jr. He's named after my father.
Okay, and what were your parents' names and occupations?
My father was George Nelson Carter Sr., who went by the name of Nelson, and he was a funeral director, and we invested in land and other projects.
Okay. What about your mother?
My mother's name is Miriam Teresa Johnson Carter. She is a native of Gloucester as well, but she grew up north in Philadelphia. She is remotely related to my father. They're cousins of some sort. Because Gloucester's a very small place.
And as for you, I know that you've had multiple occupations, and can you kind of walk us through the chronology of that?
Okay, when I came out of Temple, I went to work for General Smelting. I was a chemistry major, and I ran a smelter, aluminum smelter, which buys junk and scrap aluminum and melts it down into ingots and sends it off. Very dangerous, but it was a job, and it was a supervisory job. From there, I went to Philco Corporation, which was a division of Ford, and we made household appliances. In fact, we made what's called brown goods. Household appliances are white goods, refrigerators, ranges, and freezers. Brown goods are stereos and televisions and so forth.
Okay.
And we used to ship $3 or $4 million worth of televisions a day. I was a supervisor there at the warehouse, a distribution supervisor. Then I went to Philadelphia, went to New York for a year on the train. Living in Philadelphia, we had an apartment house there, so my wife was working for Acme Marcus. And I went up there for a year and got a degree in funeral service. I graduated second. The other guy cheated. Then I got the American Academy of McAllister Institute Award for proficiency, the faculty award, because I was good at it. Then I came home and worked with my dad in a funeral home where I'd grown up. And I went to work there and did everything that needed to be done for 2 years, and then I took the boards and became a licensee. I believe it's 1973. And then I began to be interested in the laws that govern funeral service, which weren't that good. And so I began to lobby the legislature, just as a businessman, not in other capacity. And we wrote a lot of good law. And I became a member of the Virginia Morticians Association as soon as I had a license. That's the organization for predominantly black funeral directors and embalmers. And after some time, I began to represent them in the legislature. And I do till today. With a lobbyist for 30 years. We wrote the first law that I lobbied was a law to eliminate assistant funeral directors being given funeral directors licenses who didn't have any embalming or formal training in health sciences and all that stuff. The next one we lobbied was to eliminate funeral directors and embalmers as separate licenses. So have one license for everybody, because everybody had to have the training followed from the first law. And that's called a single license law. The next one I lobbied was a law to create a licensed establishment manager for each funeral home, somebody who was responsible for the conduct of the firm. The consumers were saying if they had a problem with the funeral director, the guy would fire him, the firm would keep on going. Well, the guy might not even fire him, but there was no way to get the management of the firm to be responsible for the acts of individuals. So we wrote a law that says there's a licensed established manager in every building. Then I went to see Chuck Robb one day because they asked me to find if we could get someone from our association appointed to the board of funeral directors. And that's done by the governor. And I went in and I told him the candidates that they wanted. And he said, well, is there anybody else you might suggest? And I had a resume in my pocket, coincidentally. So Chuck Robb made me a member of the board of funeral directors at the Barbers, which is a 9-year appointment because it's a large board. In that capacity, I guess the biggest thing I did, I became part of the informal conference committee, which is the committee that does discipline. If you're summoned to the board, you have what's called an informal conference with a hearing officer, but it's not a trial. And I was on that committee, so we saw what the problems were and began to work on them. Then the consumers came and said that they wanted a itemized statement of funeral services given to everybody who comes in the funeral home. They wanted funeral homes to give consumers a price list so they know what they were selecting. They wanted all the merchandise in the funeral home to be accurately marked, the services accurately priced, and then when you went in to talk about a funeral home, you walked out with a contract that described exactly what you purchased, exactly what those things were charged, the price, because they're on the itemized price list, and you could take that home and think about it, or you could do what you wanted to do. It wasn't an irrevocable document. Well, the Virginia Funeral Directors Association, that's the Caucasian group, didn't like it because they had clients, some of whom they had a relation such that they would say, oh, we don't want to talk about price at a time like this. We think your grandmother ought to have a nice casket, maybe 2 limousines, and blah, 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 and we'll give you a bill when it's all over. And about 2 weeks after the funeral, you'd get another bill and make you cry all over again. And they liked that because they could determine what people would get based upon the people that they knew or didn't know, or sometimes just a make of automobile that drove up to the yard. Somebody came up with a nice big Buick or Oldsmobile in those days. You're too young to remember the Oldsmobile, I guess. But you just look out the window and say, oh, they're pretty good. Let's see if we can't sell them a nice casket. Or if they came in a ragged Ford, you say, well, not much to these people. In other words, they were deciding what people wanted before the people got there and giving them a deal that could have been taken advantage of them. And there was no way for the people to check or know, or even compare it with another funeral home, because you wouldn't get a price list from another funeral home. You'd have to come in and talk. They wanted prices given over the telephone so they could discuss these things. And so my association, I said, no, we're going to be in favor of this. For one thing, if you run against the tide of history to be against the consumers. The Virginia Cooperative Consumer Council and the AARP wanted it. And I wanted to give the guys something they can vote for. As a lobbyist, the name of the game is to get your legislation through. And you do that by giving legislators something they can vote for and a reason to vote for it. There was no reason not to give the information people wanted. So I was chairman of the legislative committee of the board, and I sat down and we wrote the Virginia itemized statement, the general price list law, Virginia Funeral Service rule. And the consumers loved it. And it was successful in Virginia. 5 years later, the Federal Trade Commission had been tasked by the same consumer groups to come up with a national funeral rule. And so they hold hearings. And they have over the Congress or Congressional Hall, they have hearings, and the people fly in their jet planes and their Gucci loafers, and they sit down for $500 an hour. They submit a document, triplicate it, they bill their clients and have a good time. But that's not the way law is written. Law is written by lobbyists. Why? It sounds corrupt, but if you're going to write a law about plumbing, you got school teachers and lawyers and doctors and house painters. You got all kinds of people in the legislature who don't know anything about plumbing. So what they need is for some plumber to come in and tell them what the law needs to say. And that's the way the plumbing codes are written. Well, funeral service, most people don't know anything about funeral service, so how could they write a rule? And the legislators, the Trade Commission, didn't know what to do, except they knew there was the first law ever written was in Virginia. And I wrote it, so they called to Richmond. And they said, who can we send up here to talk to us about the law? So while they're having hearings across the street, I drove up with a copy of the statute, the regulations, the general price list, the items of goods and services selected, and general price list, whatever, all the stuff that you had to have. And in the Federal Trade Commission building, have you been up there? It's a beautiful building. It looks like a big ship headed toward the Capitol. It's got a round end on the end. And in that round end, there's a beautiful round end table. A gorgeous place. So I dropped all the stuff on the table, and their lawyers looked at it and said, what do you think? I said, we've been doing it for 5 years. Half of you guys live in Virginia. You know it works. And they said, okay. So they continued with the hearings across the street, and everybody got paid. And they adopted the Virginia rule, basically without change. They put some federal verbiage in it because they had to do something, but it was our law. And the basic principle was, when you buy a funeral, it's like buying a car. You should be able to look on the side of the car and know what the muffler costs, what the tires cost, what the large oversized engine costs, what the standard parts are, what's not. The same thing was on the side of the car. That's what I wanted people to be able to do when they bought a funeral. So it was adopted. Well, it was sunsetted. It was supposed to sunset in 10 or 12 years, but anyway, 13 years later, a couple years ago, it sunsetted, which means it had to be reviewed to see if it was still current and applicable and needed any changes. And the guys came out, the Gucci loafers and the jet planes, and they had their hearings and it went on for a little while, and then the Federal Trade Commission readopted the rule without change. So I'm really proud of that because I did it myself. The Federal Trade Commission rule governs the entire United States. Every funeral director who practices, or funeral firm that practices in the country has to abide by this law, even if they don't have a board. There's one state, Colorado, who has no regulation for funeral service, which is a bit of a joke, but anyway, even they have to abide by this law. And it means it's possible for me or any other funeral director to call some guy in Missouri and say, I have a family who's going to be coming out there and I want a casket or I want them to meet at the airport. Use your chapel, use your limousines and go to the cemetery. And he has to tell me exactly what it's going to cost. And the same thing is for anybody else. If I ask him for his general price list, he pushes a button on his computer and it comes on my machine. Because you have to be able to convey this information. So it makes the trade a lot easier to do. Well, the Virginia Funeral Directors Association, the other guys, have a publication that they put out every year, the National Funeral Directors Association. And they had a 50th anniversary edition in which they went back for 50 years and they said what the wages of the average person were and what the funeral cost. And every year by year by year. The largest increase in revenue was in the year we adopted the itemized pricing rule. It turns out the consumers were willing to buy more than you had as imagination because they were willing to buy more than you had planned to give them. And so everybody made money for all the fighting and arguing they gave against us. It worked out very well for everybody. And some consumers walked in and said, I just want instant cremation, and somebody else said, I want a bronze casket. And people got to pick out what they want. I want one limousine, I want 5 of them, I want a horse and a carriage. Oh yeah, horse and carriage, $1,700. I'll get the guy out here. No problem at all.
Well, I have a question about that. Why is the Mortuary Association ethic a little different than the Funeral Directors Association?
Because the black funeral directors tend to have smaller firms, smaller volumes, and they don't make as much money. The other guys make money because it's funeral service, but they think they're smarter than they are. And they have lobbyists, they hire lawyers for lobbyists, and they're not very good. We had one of them who came to us first because I was a lobbyist, and he figured that some of the guys' association talked to him. What you need is you need a professional guy, you need a lawyer, and I'll be glad to be your guy. So they hired him, and he promised that even though he was going to make a similar contract with the other association, since all of our interests are coincidental, he would, but he'd never back us in opposition to, back them in opposition to us. Well, they hired him, and he sent them a bill every year, and not a whole lot happened in the legislature, because a lobbyist who's not in the profession doesn't know what the problems are until the profession goes and tells him, we want you to write something to this effect. In order to do that, the profession has to have committee meetings and conventions, and it's just such a burdensome product that when he speaks to the legislature, he can't be flexible. He can't say, well, okay, why don't we try this? Because his principals haven't allowed him to do that, and he doesn't know anything about the business. As a funeral director, I was able to negotiate because I knew exactly what the business interests were. They're different because they hire these guys. They have a convention every year, which is a big convention, lots of people come, and they don't make any money. The Virginia Mortician Association is the wealthiest funeral directors association in the country. We got all kinds of money. But they hire $5,000 motivational speakers. You'll have some Republican come in and tell them, the more you steal, the better you're going to be, and it's okay, greed is great, and they pay these guys, and they have a convention, they pay their executive director $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, and they had to have a headquarters, which they lost. In other words, it's a very large bureaucracy, and it's dominated by large firms that are often multinational, multi-state or international, like Service Corporation International. The large firms have distinctly different interests than the little guys.
Okay, so just remind me, what years were the key lobbying efforts that took you from Virginia to DC?
I took the Federal Trade Commission. I took the Virginia Trade Rule
Right.
to D.C. and it became the Federal Trade Commission rule, which covers the whole country.
Right, but what year was that?
1980, 90 perhaps. 90, because that was 13 years ago. Oh, that'd be 1980. That's a long time ago.
Okay.
85, something like that.
Okay.
I don't remember. It was a long time ago. I got an award in the wall.
Okay, we'll look at it. So, did you ever experience that kind of division in Gloucester?
Well, in Gloucester, the black families always patronized black firms, and the white families always patronized white firms. It wasn't negotiable. It wasn't even interesting. It was the custom of the trade. Newport News, when I came here, was a bit different. I came to Denby, and we're outside of we're a military retirement area, and the military people have been socialized to get along, and they're intermarried. So right off the bat, we got the contract. We had the contract for 13 years to do all the military services that originate on the base. Like a kid gets killed on a motorcycle, or commits suicide, or gets shot or something. It was our job to prepare him and put him in a casket and send him on back to wherever it is. One sent a man to Pago.
Where's that?
French Polynesia. The body had to go to California. From California had to go over the top to Japan. From Japan it had to go to Australia, and from Australia it had to go back to Pago. And the Polynesian people have a community here. And it's interesting to see how each community grieves differently.
Right.
They grieve by hugging each other and pounding on their backs. Seriously.
That is really interesting.
That is really interesting. I once sent a man back to the reservation who was a Navajo. What was most interesting was that his hair texture was completely different from anybody's hair I've ever known. They're almost in the same race. It's sort of like Chinese because it came over the top from Alaska, but it's very straight and very hard, like horsehair. And we put him in a wooden casket and sent him back to the reservation. They put the casket up on 4 big poles, put a big fire under it, and sent him on back to the gods.
Wow.
Yeah, that interesting. The Korean funeral here. Mama San died. If Mama San dies, everybody comes to the funeral home, and the first thing you want to know is, when can we see her? We want to watch the body. We want to see her. Undress her. They had to do that, and then she was here for like overnight, 2 nights, the viewing night, and then between that and the day of the funeral, she was never left unattended. Family members were sitting in the chapel. Little kids were on the back bench doing their homework, being very, very good. And I stayed upstairs in the apartment, so I'd be with them through the night. And the next morning we had a Korean funeral, which culminates by throwing all kinds of Korean money all over the castle, and then closing it up and burying it. It's counterfeit, but that's, you've got to have a beautiful fruit. I have some pictures of the beautiful fruit bowls, because you got to have some food. And each piece of fruit was perfect. And then on the other side, we had to build an altar with lots of stuff, and then a Buddha on the top. And the guys came in from the faith in their little saffron robes, and they did their Korean service. But they brought a device that plugs into the wall the size of a pack of cigarettes that does the chant all night for them. So they haven't got to sit up and chant all night. And it's interesting because the thing goes, and I had to explain that it was running as the people came in to assemble for the funeral. And you could see the American people wondering what this weird sound was. It continued to go into cyclical things. So I explained to them that if you listen to it with your eyes closed, you'll get an idea of the cycle of yin and yang. And that's what it's really telling you. Just about the time it disappears, it comes back again, it becomes full. And that's what you're listening to. And so the monks like that. Somebody back in their play. But we do that. But I've had a wonderful life in funeral service. We got the government contract by selling the $700 toilet seat. You know how you sell a $700 toilet seat? You only sell one of them. The way it is, they had a contract that said you had to be prepared to ship 120 bodies if they died in active duty in the area. You had to be prepared to do that, and you had to give a price for the caskets, you had to have a price for the embalming and preparation. Then they said, well, some of these people are going to need to have air trays because they're going to travel in an airplane, so give us a price on 10 air trays, right? So I gave them a ridiculously high price on the 10 air trays because I'm going to sell 10 of them. Okay? And then we lowballed the 126. Well, it meant that the whole bill would beat anybody else's bid. And what the government's concerned is the bottom line. They don't care how you get there. Mm-hmm. So if you're only going to sell you're going to sell a toilet seat for one airplane, for 100 airplanes, but they only ask you to price one, you only price one, you make it $700. Then when you sell 100 airplanes, you get $700,000. Mm-hmm. In other words, the idea, the thing was, it was clever enough that they didn't figure it out, and after about 15 years, they decided I was getting it too often, and they decided to open it up for everybody. but by that time, we had a sort of an international practice. We vary all sorts of people of all sorts of races, though most of the people, of course, are the neighborhood black folks.
Right.
But they're retirees, and they're great to do business with because you can't be an E9 or E8 unless you pay your bills.
Yeah. Well, we're moving really fast, so I kind of want to start at the beginning, if that's okay.
There's more to that. It was more. If you're going to be here all day, I got another life. Okay.
I know. Weren't you a sheriff?
I was a deputy sheriff. When my father and mother. Well, I might as well start from the beginning. It's going to work out okay. Okay. That fellow over there, his name was James Andrew Carter. He was my grandfather's. He's my father's father. Okay. His father was named Gabriel Carter, who grew up before the war, antebellum. And he had Gabriel, Randall, James, and Andrew were the four sons. And they all lived on Shelley Plantation, and all the records show all this stuff. Shelley Plantation is on the Carter's Creek. It's across the river from Roswell. That's the other side of the creek. The poor pages, they were called. The rich pages are on the side. And when the war broke out, Randall and James and Andrew slipped on down to Hampton and joined the Navy. Well, I don't know what happened to Randall, but I know that James and Andrew were injured on the last day of the war. They were in a stone fort, very much like Fort Monroe, down at Key West that controlled the corner to come around from Florida. And on the last day of the war, when telegraph came that Richmond had fallen, they had a grand celebration. They fired off all the cannons in the fort. And in this granite fort, they blew their eardrums out. So after they got back, after the war, they were entitled to compensation. So we have the records of the trials and just justified them receiving these pensions and things. In order to do, they had to interview my grandfather and all the people who lived on Shelley because they knew these guys couldn't hear like they used to hear. And they got paid. Well, my grandpa Gabriel didn't go to war because he had a pass. He was a free agent. He was entitled to sort of take care of himself when there was no planting or harvesting because the poor pages really didn't want to support him indefinitely. And so he had a little skiff. In those days, most people had what's called a log canoe. It was modeled after Indian boats and made out of sometimes one or two logs, but it was a sharp-pointed, very hydrodynamically perfect boat. And everybody had one. He had a small sail canoe, and he would go around the shore. You could pick up oysters right off the shore. You could get clams just by walking around and stepping on them, which you could still do. And he would load up the boat during the war, and at night he would row out of Carter's Creek to where Gage's Rock Light is, pick up the current. The current in the York River goes about a knot and a half. And he'd be at Yorktown in 3 hours, just sort of paddling along. Very inconspicuous because it's nighttime. When he got to shore at Yorktown, he would sell his seafood or whatever produce he had to an organized effort by the Yankees to purchase from local farmers. Of course, they meant black farmers because the white guys wouldn't give them anything. But they paid off in gold. And anything is better than eating hardtack and beans, so this went over great. They had about 3,000 black people who they had to feed as well as the troops. So there was a continual consumption of food, and the more they could get locally, the more they could subvert the currency, the Confederate currency, which was paper. And at the same time, it made some people rich. Well, he came away with money, gold buried in the ground. When the war was over, and the Pages had gone broke, and Roosevelt was falling apart, he bought 3 big sail canoes. These are 40-footers. These are made like out of 5 logs. They still race them up in Maryland, in the Chesapeake Bay. They have sail canoe race. And some of them are actually log canoes. Most of them now are made out of herringbone, out of planks of wood. But this was the Peterbilt truck, the 40-foot trailer of commerce at that time. And he was able to buy 3 of them, one for himself and one for Uncle George, this guy's brother, and one for him. So he was captain of an oyster boat, 40-foot oyster boat, 16 years old. They would go and harvest oysters, which involved towing. You just pick them up, put them in a boat, and sell them to the buy boats that came down from Baltimore. But if you owned your own boat, 1/3 went to the boat, 1/3 went to the captain, and 1/3 went to the crew. So you kept 2/3 of the money, and you got paid the same price for oysters as anybody else. In other words, you made a white man's wage. There's always been money in seafood, so they made a lot of money. So this guy began to lend money. His name is James Andrew. He began to lend money to other people who had oyster boats who were profligate. It would come spring when they had to haul the boats up out of the water and paint the bottoms and fix all the stuff and get the engines running. They wouldn't have any money. So he would lend them money. And at the end of the season, he'd collect with 6% interest. He always charged 6% because you can figure it out on the back of your hand. He had a 3rd-grade education. So he did that long enough that he found out that a lot of people in Gloucester wanted to own their own land. And so he and a guy named T.C. Walker, you probably heard of, and Hollis Price, who was the successor to Patterson at the Pollynole Gloucester Institute. Okay? So he and Price, and they organized a bank called the Gloucester Land Building and Loan, which was basically run out of the north room of my grandfather's house. And my grandmother, Sarah, that woman up there with the Indian-looking face, is not an Indian. So she was the one who did all the bookkeeping. And they did that from like 1916 or so until 1933. And they financed any family who wanted to own their own land at 6%. In 1933, the Roosevelt administration closed all the land banks because they had a savings and loan crisis. And all the land banks were upside down. They had borrowed money from the New York banks, the Chicago banks, the Richmond banks, and they were broke. But the white banks wouldn't lend the Gloucester Land Building Loan a thin dime. So they didn't owe anybody anything. So when they closed down the bank, they had money in boxes, they had deeds in boxes, and they had notes receivable. And what they did was they divided them up by thirds. And my grandfather was supposed to have been like the 2nd or 3rd richest guy in the county, local guy in the county. They all came out really well, and we're still spending Grandpa's money. And we still have some of the land. They bought 100 acres of Shelley. As soon as the war was over and the Pages went broke, it was went to auction, I think 76, something like that. They bought 100 acres of Shelley, which we have a lot of that land now in the family. The bank closed, and he went on lending money privately. He didn't go to the river after his first son, Stanley, that handsome guy in the 3rd picture there. When he was born, Grandpa said he's going to come in off the river and let somebody else run the boat, which meant he got the boat share, but he didn't get the captain's share. And he went into banking, and of course they were always farming. That they didn't mind work. They had each of the brothers had 50 of the 100 acres, and Grandpa didn't. They would work that with a couple of horses and some cows, and they raised corn, wheat, and beans like everybody else does. They didn't raise tobacco for some reason, and then they would go to the river in the fall, and they would sell watermelons to Norfolk and things like that. My father loved to ride his sailboat was called the Three Sisters, and they would load it up with as many watermelons as they could fill it with. But the hold was full, the front cabin was full, the back engine box was full, and the things always leveled with watermelons. And they'd sleep on the watermelons as they went down to Norfolk, and they would sell them. The best customer they had was Elder Mayshaw, gospel spreading farm, happy in mind Mayshaw, who had a huge fundamentalist following, a little village that he'd actually built in Suffolk, which you can still find. Lots of little houses and a little reception area and stuff like that. And he would, if he came to Norfolk, they would land at Light Street Dock, which is where the waterside is now. Was the Anheuser-Busch pier had been there. Oh, you got to be old to know this kind of stuff. and he would buy the whole boatload. They always paid fairly. But what you do is you take your watermelons down and you lay alongside the other guys who were selling. And when they sold out, they would move, and the boats would move till you got to be next to the pier, and then you'd sell your watermelons or whatever it was you were selling. So they worked very hard. They worked from Can't See to Can't See, and even though they were wealthy, it didn't make a bit of difference. They just worked. That bottom picture there, the guy with the overalls, the big overalls in the middle of the bottom, that's Grandpa James. Just about 1950, because myself and my brother are the two kids down front, and then my father standing behind my brother. And he still worked. When the guys, he sent his boys, he sent Stanley, the first son, to Hampton, and he gave him a free ride. But Fred and Nelson, the two other brothers, they had to work their way through school. They were not, it was primogeniture, the first kid got everything. And so they worked their way through school. And then as soon as they got out of school, there was no way they're going back to the farm. That was it. Uncle Fred got a degree in agriculture and became a farm agent in King Queen County. Uncle Stanley became a professor, and he taught diesel engineering in Hampton for years, and then he went with Point 4 to Indonesia to support the government there. And the communists came in, they threw all the rich Americans out, and he came back and he retired from Norfolk State. Aunt Julia, Stanley's sister, Stanley's wife, was the principal of Moden School in Hampton. From the day it opened, it was a new brick school, and she was until she retired. They have a lovely home on the York River, with some cabana and stuff, which the children haven't heard. We have, Uncle Fred has a house behind them, sort of up on the hill, and we're next door. Ours is on the river as well, which is where my daughter lives. But all of that land originally had been financed to the people who owned it by the Gloucester Land Building and Loan. They owned virtually all the land from Hayes' store to Gloucester Point along the York River. Most of that land was in the hands of Gloucester Land Building and Loan. T.C. Walker controlled most of it. He would not sell to black people. He'd sell to white people. But the part that had been the Stokes property had been previously done, and we own a piece of that. But all this goes back to the business. So that's what they did. My grandmother, his wife, though she looks like she's Indian, and we thought she was, I had my DNA done, and it turns out he looks 75% West African, because that's where he came from. But we're 25% or more Celtic and Mediterranean. That is to say, there are two groups of genetics. There's the genetics, which is the Roman Empire, and then the people north of the Roman Empire, the Celts, who have been at war with the Roman Empire forever. And so, and then the other portion is Indian American, but Indian from India. So there's two little women on the end there who have that pretty hair and the sharp features are my mother's sister's children. My mother's sister was just like that. I had no idea that they were East Indian. She, on the other hand, had been reputed to be an Indian, but she wasn't, because there's absolutely no American Indian blood in my genome, which is unusual. But my family's been there so long, they actually sort of bifurcated off before the admission of the Indians. And so she's actually a Talifer from Ware Neck, one of the old families of Virginia. They don't like to talk about it, but she was. And that's why she looks the way she looks. And if you ever seen a Talifer, they all have this narrow attached face. But they're one of the really old families that never had admixed. And they owned a lot of what's Ware Neck in Virginia, and that's where she came from. Her brother, she and her brother, that guy there, and this guy here, his name is Thomas Jefferson Whiting. He's a descendant of Sally Hemings, as is she. So that's him and his wife. He went north and went to work for John Kennedy's father, the old man. Became his major domo. He made a lot of money just listening to the guys, talking to him. He was there all the time. When he got sick, he had a heart attack in Florida. They sent the Electra jet down there to pick him up and take him back to Boston. So he was quite successful up there. The only man I knew had a Chesterfield coat, velvet collar and a jacket, beautiful coat. But anyway, that's Jeff, her brother. Her sister married a gardener. And they had a large store in Ware Neck. The store's gone now, but they had a major store in Ware Neck, right down the street from the post office. And his relative is James Daniel Gardner, who was the only person to ever win a Congressional Medal of Honor from Virginia. So, because he was my cousin, sort of, I figured he ought to be recognized. And we put together a project to put a memorial in the court green. Because at Saluda, Chesty Puller has one. I mean, the people who won, there's two up there because they had two Medal of Honor winners. And it's sort of customary in these rural courthouses that you always have a Confederate memorial in the middle of the cemetery. You know, cause never dies. But Gloucester now has a memorial which I designed. It has the same rock-hewn finish as the big one on the other side. It's made in 3 blocks, and the top has a slant on it, and it has the wording of the Congressional Medal, but it has this picture, because back in the Civil War, they were beginning to take photographs, and we had a copy of the picture, and we made it into a ceramic to put on the stone. But I put 3 big blocks, and then this thing with this little picture on it, because I figured sooner or later somebody's going to be hateful and knock the picture off. But they wouldn't hardly damage the whole stone. They'd be satisfied with the face in the picture. Well, it's up there for 6 years until one day the county called and said somebody knocked the picture off. No problem. I called the company, had a picture of me in another 5 or 10 days, slapped it on there and keep on going. So I designed it so even in vandalism it wouldn't be typically irreparable. Every year, my church organization, the Gloucester Union Relief Association, which is all the churches that came out of slavery in 1866, met. The first place they met was at Zion Poplar's Baptist Church, which you probably know where that is, right? That was where the first meeting was held. And on the 5th Sunday of every month, all the churches would come together in alternate churches. So 4 or 5 times a year, they'd have a 5th Sunday service. And that would be the largest single offering that would be collected in any given year because all the churches chipped in. The money was supposed to be used for building churches, maintaining indigent pastors and their wives, the widows. And they began meeting on the 5th Sunday. They met on the 5th Sunday ever since. It's one of the oldest organizations that I know of, way older than the NAACP and stuff like that. This goes all the way back to 1866. Well, I'm the pastor of a church. I saw a burning bush. Now we know he's crazy. I bought a funeral home. I bought a building, Stuckey's Restaurant in Williamsburg. I wanted to expand, and just working with my dad was a lot of fun. But I wanted to have my own place, and so I bought this building in Williamsburg, and began to do business over there. And we had just bought the building. It was a Stuckey's Restaurant. You've seen that, right? A lot of glass across the front and the slope roof. They're old with the side where they were. And they'd been bypassed by 64. It was on the old road. So the guy couldn't get anything for it, and I bought it. But just after I bought it, they had an ice storm, and all the lines were down. The pipes in this building, which depended on electricity for water and heat, were in the attic, which meant if they froze, I was going to be ruined. I just bought this thing. And so I moved the family's apartment in the back. I took all them over to Gloucester and brought back a huge salamander heater, which is like a tub of kerosene with a pipe on the top that you use in warehouses. And I lit it right in the floor of the chapel, which had a terrazzo floor, and that's the only heat we had in the building. And the dog and I went back into my bedroom, and we had the front door cracked for some fresh air. But burning that thing inside the building, almost suicidal, but we don't want the pipes to freeze. And we were sort of remote from it, and the dog's beside me. So I'm sitting up as the temperature goes down, watching the temperature go down. It gets down like 44 degrees before the story ends. And the dog's beside me, and I figured that the dog would show distress from carbon monoxide before I would, but I couldn't go to sleep. So I was awake for like 36 hours or more. And the second night, it's still very dark because there's no lights, which means there's no skylights, there's no electricity. The sky glow that comes from the city, that wasn't there. It was cloudy because it was still like snowy and miserable. So it was pitch black in this room, me and the dog. And so I'm sitting on the bed, wrapped up in a blanket because it was warmer than lying on the mattress. The cold actually came through the mattress. Me and the dog. And in the darkness, I saw a flash of light. Well, look, suddenly suspended above the floor with roots going this way and branches going that. It was the most beautiful tree I've ever seen in my life. And it was all lit up. It was the tip of each branch was a little fire with flowers, and that was what was making the light. And like Moses, I turned aside to see this wondrous sight, how this bush burned but was not consumed. The bush was burning at such a rate that it was being consumed at the same rate by the fire, except the growth was constant. The fire on the tips of the branches seemed to vary depending on how I responded to this vision. And I knew it, the Lord speaks, he don't say anything, it's all in your head. And he said, play with it in your mind. And so when I said, this is because I've been up too late and there's probably no good air in here, and this is a hallucination, the fires began to go and began to consume the bush because the bush is going at one rate. The fire got bigger, began to eat the bush up. I know I do not want this thing to disappear. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I'm on the side of the bush. And the Lord said, look, I make stuff be. Or as Moses was told, I am that I am. I make stuff be. I'm the God of creation. And this is my creation. This is symbolic of my creation. There's another personality out there who seeks to destroy it. That's the fire. And everywhere in every religion, the devil is represented by this destruction of fire. And they're in a balance, a dynamic balance. And this is the most interesting thing that goes into preach. He said it makes a difference to me how you respond. It made a difference to that bush how I responded. I had a part in the life of the world to come, either destructive or progressive, and I wanted to be on the right side of that argument. And so I said, are those fires really evil? And he said, okay, I'll show you something. And the flames, not only did they get bigger, they began to spit out at me like serpent's tongues. And literally, I'll tell my church, any church that asks me, I will tell them, it scared hell out of me. I had nothing to do with that fire from that time to this, because it's okay to think, as they say in Game of Thrones, that really Game of Thrones. You watch Game of Thrones? Oh, what a thing, you're missing out of life. It's okay to tell children about God so that they'll behave. And a lot of people's religions like that. It's just a system we use to try to people to behave, and the younger they are, the easier they are to persuade. That's one thing. But when you see the thing, and things begin to happen in your life that there's no way to account for, then you got to believe that's part of the deal. You've seen it for yourself. I know for myself and not in others, the way St. Paul said. I was buying and selling land. My dad was surprised. I had a Jewish partner. He wasn't too fond of Jews because he was a country boy and he didn't trust them. But Fred Jacobs and I, he was a lab student at the Institute of Marine Science getting his graduate degree. And I was deputy sheriff. I got to be deputy sheriff because in the process of doing civil rights work, I had integrated the school. I went to total integration. Okay, this is the way it works. My father and mother, in spite of the fact that my dad had a good deal of money, my father was independent. He supported himself. The land in Gloucester Courthouse was He'd gotten it from from his father, but he built this house and did all this business. And just about the time he gets things going, the NAACP is organized in Muriel Mack's house in Cologne, in King and Queen. The Tri-County NAACP was King and Queen, Gloucester, and Matthews. And they had a meeting at which they were going to try to make things better for black people. The NAACP was a new idea. So my father drove T.C. Walker, his father's partner, up there to the meeting. Well, at the time, T.C. Walker was the man. He was head Negro in charge of everything. He ran the school. He was a delegate to the national conventions, and he was nominated by the administration to be director of Negro affairs and all this kind of stuff. So they get up to this meeting, and he says, I really have a lot of responsibility, and I don't prefer to be the first president. He wanted to be the president. He wanted them to ask him to be the president.
Wireless.
On the way back home from the meeting, my father was like the president. And he was like, 25, something like that. And he noticed that T.C. Walker was strangely quiet in the car and seemed to be perturbed. And she said, what's the matter, sir? This thing don't do nothing. This thing ain't going nowhere. They got the wrong people in charge of it. They should have asked me. So at that point, he became hostile to my father and the NAACP, which was okay because he was making money off of the existing system. He had been a solicitor of funds for Rosenwald schools, and he built a lot of money. And Gloucester, I think, had 7 or 8 Rosenwald schools, where most counties didn't have maybe one. And T.C. Walker had not only that, but he had the biggest one, the T.C. Walker Training School, which was his own little bailiwick. That was a 2-story building at the time. I think it cost him $4,000, of which he raised over 3. I mean, the idea that the Rosenwalds gave people schools is not true. They would match your funds, and quite often, as in Gloucester, they didn't even come, maybe a third of the money. Most of the money actually came out of the community. So anyway, they had this system of these little frame buildings with outhouses and things that was the black school system, and T.C. Walker was in charge of it. My father and Dr. Turner, and a guy named Dr. Robert Turner, who was my godfather, who used to live in the courthouse, and a guy named McCurley Garnett, who was the North Carolina Mutual agent in Gloucester after my father gave it up. They became the principal officers of Gloucester NAACP, and they filed suit for equal schools. The first suit they filed, the NAACP filed, I'm getting chronologically, the first suit they filed, as soon as my father got to be president, a girl got on the bus, a young lady got on the bus at Hayes' store. She'd come from Baltimore to drop her kids off with her mom because she'd had an ectopic pregnancy and she simply couldn't lift and carry them. She was going back to Baltimore with this operation, and she's lost this child. She's sitting on the 4th seat from the back of the bus next to a woman who has a new baby in her lap. So she's got this cooing baby beside her. She's got her own sense of loss. She's in pain. And she's not thinking about anything. She's on the 4th seat from the back of the bus where she belongs. Nice little Seventh-day Adventist woman named Irene Morgan. So she gets as far as Saluda. And the bus driver comes in with 1 or 2 white people and says, you're going to have to get up because you can't share the seat with a white person. The woman with the baby was willing to get up, even though Irene Morgan said, don't get up. You're going to carry this baby for the next 7 hours, a 7-hour trip to Baltimore. And stopping every so often and bouncing around and smelling diesel fumes and all of that. So the woman got up and moved, but they wouldn't let her sit on the same seat with this white person. So the sheriff said, the bus driver said she had to get up. And she said she cannot stand. She's had an operation. She's in the back of the bus. I simply can't do it. Well, he went and got the sheriff, because at Saluda, the sheriff's office right across the street. You been up there? Okay, well, the sheriff, the Route 17 made a T-bone intersection at 33, and at that corner, which is right in front of Saluda Courthouse, there was a gas station, an Esso gas station with a little peak roof. It's now Exxon. And that was the bus terminal. They sold the tickets at the gas station, but it's directly across from the court, and right behind the court was the sheriff's office and jail, which are still there. So the sheriff came across to the bus and told her she had to get off the bus, and she said no. And Ms. Morgan said he laid his hands on me. Now, she's a nice lady, but she's a Gregory. She's related to Leon Gregory, who owned the wagon wheel. The Gregory's owned a lot of land down at Hayes' store. And they don't, as my grandmother said, they don't take no tea for the fever. She was in high dudgeon. This man actually put his hands on her to make her move, as sore as she was. She said she was going to bite him, but he was too dirty to bite. So she kicked him in his groin. And he went down in the middle of the bus on the floor, grasping his private parts. And the deputies came, and they dragged her off the bus and put her in the jail. And she called her mother at Hayes' store, with whom she left with the children. Her mother called the NAACP. The Morgans say the mother put up the money. The NAACP people say that Dr. Turner, who's the only guy who had any money, may have done it. But anyway, they posted they paid a $100 fine for kicking the sheriff. This is 1942, 41, whatever, it's 42. This is a lot of money. This is like over $1,000 now. But they didn't pay the $10 for Faye to move because they thought it was wrong. And they went to court. The judge was a guy named Catesby Graham Jones. Well, Graham Jones was a direct descendant of Catesby Jones, who was the captain of the Merrimack when the other guy got blinded. So he's a good old Virginia boy. But the deal was, the judge was not supposed to find anybody guilty of failure to move. He should find him guilty of disorderly conduct, because back in 1871 or something, there was a case called the Cure. The Cure was a mulatto woman from New Orleans. Now, New Orleans, they have a little different society. They have black folks and brown folks and yellow brown folks and high brown. She was high, but she was not white. And she had a plantation up the Mississippi River. She went up, I think she went up as far as Cincinnati. She's coming back to her plantation, and she's in a stateroom. Well, if the boat's on one side of the river, she has to get kicked out of the stateroom. But if they're on the Ohio side, she can stay in the stateroom. And she was bounced around. They finally put her on the deck. She refused to go below. And so she slept on the deck. And when you got to New Orleans, she sued the owner of the boat. And she won. Because this is New Orleans. And she's high class mulatto. Well, the case went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court did the same thing they did last month. They sustained the court. They turned it back to the Louisiana court, but they did not make a ruling on the merits. And so, lurking out there was this, you got $1,000 from this guy way back in. Well, he was furious. The guy actually on the boat had to pay him. And so, they didn't want to try this thing in federal court because DeCure was out there lurking. It's like you wouldn't want to go for a DOMA case now, like Pennsylvania, the woman under the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, she's not going to defend it, right? Well, this was the problem. They didn't want to get caught up in a federal case. So when Catesby Jones decided he was going to find the woman, Graham Jones, his son was Catesby, was the common attorney for years, all the same name. So Graham Jones decided he was going to find her guilty of disorderly conduct. It's routine. Well, she was represented by Oliver Hill and Spotswood Robinson, and ultimately Bill Hasty and Thurgood Marshall, but the young guys from Richmond came down. And Spotswood Robinson was very bright, and at the end of the case, Graham Jones asked for his trial notes because he had suckered it. He said, "Your Honor, I don't think you can find her guilty of disorderly conduct. We will stipulate that she kicked the sheriff, but she paid a $100 fine. That's the disorderly conduct, and all of her disorder was subsumed into that charge. So the only thing you can do is either find her guilty of failure to move or let her go. We will stipulate she did not move." So now Jones was hoisted upon his own petard. He had to find her guilty of what was a federally appealable case, and 2 years later the Supreme Court ruled that she did not have to move, which meant that everybody riding on a bus, train, plane, ferry, anything to cross interstate lines, because it was interstate commerce suit, could sit anywhere they wanted to. And that's what provoked the first freedom rides in 1949, where they got shot up and the buses got blown up. Well, it was all because, and they had a song, "You don't have to ride Jim Crow." Irene Morgan, won her case, "You don't have to ride Jim Crow." And they're singing these songs as they're going through the South. Didn't go over too well, they got blown up, all this kind of stuff. But that was she was 11 years ahead of Rosa Parks. Rosa Parks' case was a municipal case, so because Birmingham's the middle of the state, it didn't have implications of interstate commerce. But so they had to win that one the hard way. But after they had been out there walking around in the rain and snow for 444 days, whatever it was, for a year, it wasn't until the federal court ruled that they had to integrate the buses in Germantown that they actually did it. It was the court case that did it. Now, it helps to have CBS News and dogs chewing on people and all this kind of stuff. So Rosa Parks became a great hero because CBS and ABC and NBC said she was. Nobody even noticed Irene Morgan. But when she won the case, of course, it made everybody. It made the Union League Association, the NAACP, Legal Defense Fund, suddenly became the most powerful civil rights organization in the country. When they went to the Supreme Court, Spot Robinson and Oliver Hill were too young. So they went and got the dean of the Howard University Law School, Thurgood Marshall, and Bill Hasty to run the case. And that was the first case he won. And when he went to the bench, he had won 33 cases and lost 3, which is a better record than anybody else had ever had before the Supreme Court. So he went on the Supreme Court, and I think it was Clarence Thomas. But anyway, that was the first case. So they'd won that case, and now the question was, we have a separate but equal doctrine. The schools are separate, but they're hardly equal. The white kids were in a nice big brick school, a body-taught school. They had, buses and free transportation, and their teachers got paid like $250 a month. Black teachers had to go to the outhouse and clean up their own places, and they got $150 a month when they had to get to school on your own. Well, T.C. Walker ran a little bus franchise. He had a dormitory across the street from the T.C. Walker School where he would house teachers. But he wouldn't hire a local girl until the dormitory was full. Made sure he made a little money on that. He took a cut on everything that moved. And when they filed suit for equal schools, he was insulted because he worked so hard to provide these little frame schools next to the church, the Roosevelt schools. He felt like his work was being disparaged. It was being called useless. It was called second rate, which of course it was. But he didn't like that. So he actually became a lawyer for the school board. He represented the white school board against the black community. Well, they took that one to court, and the ruling was that before they wanted to build a white school, before they could build the white school, which was the one that got hit by the tornado, that was the school. Before they could build that, they had to build the T.C. Walker School first, and then the white school had to be identical to the black school. Bricks, windows, doors, microscopes, books, desks, everything exactly the same. So they won that case. There were 2 other schools in the case. One was in Prince George County called the Ralph Bunche School. Ralph Bunche had been the Secretary of the United Nations. And one was, I think, in Chase City. But anyway, the only 3 schools ever built under separate but equal, because after that, the NAACP decided they didn't want a separate but equal, they wanted total integration. And they went on with the cases that everybody knows about.
I have a quick question. Someone told me that there was an attempt to integrate Achilles High School in 1950, and that it went very poorly. And I was wondering if you knew anything about that.
Achilles was always reputedly the most difficult school to integrate because all the gentlemen down there. But I don't know of that case. I know this, that when I came along, they had separate schools and allegedly equal. Well, they weren't quite equal because in 1952, I believe it was, 5 years after the case was won, the federal officers came. My mother had to go to Philadelphia and send money home. My father's business, because of these lawsuits, had fallen to something like $1,600 gross for the year, when a Buick cost $2,000. So the business is doing poorly because people are being told and threatened not to patronize. So my mother went to Philadelphia where they paid $550 a month for school teachers. Wow, big money, big money. And she would send money home. We lived in a terrible little house in the middle of the ghetto, so these industrial houses, water in the basement, rats and all that. But she sent the money home to support the effort. And we would go back and forth on the bus. We got put off the bus one time in Maryland after the law was in effect. We took a train from Philadelphia to Baltimore, got the bus from Baltimore to go down Route 17, got on Route 3 about 4 or 5 miles above TB Junction where the road split. You wouldn't know, but it's a real place. And the bus stopped, and the guys, we were sitting right behind the driver, my brother and I, and she was on the other side. And we were excited because we could see the guy shifting the gears, and we could see the lights, and we could see it was like we were driving the bus. We were little kids. Well, he said, you're going to I take them little colored kids to go to the back of the bus like everybody else back there. There's colored people in the back, soldiers in the middle trying to get back to Quantico. So my mother said, no, there's been a law and we can't do that, all this kind of stuff in the middle of the night. And he made us get off the bus, and we were sitting on our bags beside the bus as he tried to figure out what to do. Because if he drove off and left this well-dressed school teacher and these little kids on the side of Route 3 in the dark, Greyhound might have had a problem. And so he waits for the cops to come. Well, as a kid, we went to the best school. We went to the Logan Demonstration School in Philadelphia. My mother pulled some strings and got us in there. It was run by a woman named Dr. Liveright, who's in the World Book Encyclopedia back in those days for being a great educator. And so we had a really great thing. But at that school, they had a big Irish cop who would come in. He would put kids on his lap, and he was called Officer Friendly. And Officer Friendly would tell you, don't be afraid of the police officer. If you ever have a problem, call a police officer. He will help. He's got a gun and a stick, but he's not there to hurt you. He's to protect you from other people. And everybody loved Officer Friendly. He was like Smokey the Bear. Well, we were waiting for the cop to come because I just knew that Officer Friendly was going to come around that bus and tell that man to stop cussing at my mother. Well, Officer Friendly came around that bus and he used words I didn't even know. Officer Friendly was not Officer Friendly. He looked like a Confederate general, the whole outfit. And so my mother, he argued, and we got back on the bus, and my mother compromised. We sat in the aisle. We didn't sit on the seat. We sat in the aisle on our bags all the way back home while she stood up over. She was so mad that she was crying. She was dripping water on us as she stood over us in the middle of the bus. But the guy didn't have a heart. He couldn't figure out what to do. She's not in the seat. Nobody says you can't stand, so she's standing over her babies. Well, the bus was really late because of this argument, and the Quantico soldiers, they were complaining, oh, lady, come on, we're going to be late. We're going to be AWOL at 12 o'clock. The black folks in the back of the bus said, oh, come on, get back here. There ain't nothing wrong with going to the back of the bus. All that kind of stuff. We get more trouble from them than we're from anybody else. Sitting beside the bus, waiting to figure out how this thing was going to happen, there was a woman right above us. The bus was not air conditioned, it was over, so I remember the window was open, and I could see her, and this little white lady was looking down at this woman and her children. She was crying. She was crying. So we get home, and the bus is terribly late. So my the funeral home was right there across the hospital, so the bus would stop and let us off on the way down to Morgan's drugstore, which was where the terminal was, where the station was. So we come out and get off the bus, and my father comes across the lawn. We called her Tree, her name was Teresa. Tree, what happened? What's going on? My mother told her what happened. My brother went to bed, and I went up and sat on the steps between the first floor and the second floor because I wanted to hear this argument because my father was so hot with her. He said, Tree, you should have gone to jail. She said, I'm just trying to get home. He said, you should have gone to jail. But they was going to put my babies in detention. I teach little kids. I know that can be a permanent mark on their personality to be jailed, and isolated from their mom and their dad in some strange jail and juvenile detention. God knows how long it would take to get them out, and I just didn't feel it was like the time to do it. And he said, if we can ask people to take these risks that we're asking them to do, we have to do it too. But she said, they're my babies, Nelson. I didn't want anything to happen to them. Well, this argument went on until I fell asleep. I have told this story to a number of groups of people, and the women side with my mother, and the men generally side with my dad. But it's a hard call. But he was not satisfied that she didn't stand. She didn't provoke the case that she could have invoked, because it turns out that it had to be invoked in each state to become a part of the state law. But Thurgood Marshall was right there in Baltimore. He could have come over and defended us, and we would have won Baltimore going away. We were in interstate commerce and everything. So that didn't work out so well. Well, when I come along, they have the equal schools, except that 5 years later, the federal officers came to see that the law had been complied with. We were told to be on our best behavior, and we loved that school. It was spotless when we got it, and we kept it that way. There was no graffiti. We walked down one side of the hall, safety patrol was in the middle, changing classes, there was no confusion. Everybody walked in the right direction. It was quiet and clean, and we were proud of that school. It was like the nicest black school in Virginia. And they came and they saw that everything was equal, and they went off and signed off that the court order had been complied with. It wasn't a week later that this truck comes up behind the school loaded with broken desks and graffiti carved stuff, and he took our stuff out. I went home and told my dad. He said, oh, hell, I gave it the office. If they wanted now, they have another president in the CB, let them go get it. I've done all I'm going to do. So it wasn't quite right. And what the system was such, they had what's called freedom of choice. which meant that if you were wealthy and smart and had your own source of income, you could choose to send your kid anywhere you wanted to. But if you depended upon white folks for a living, you had to do what was supposed to be done. Or if you were just afraid of the idea of putting your kids into this competitive situation. So you had people from my church, Shepherdsville Church, is my church, which is a church which was founded by free people of color. They're master's children. They had names like Driver, which is a title. Another name was Lemon, which is a color. Another name was Olimus, which is a color. And they were the major families that made this church together. And their kids were the first to go to the white school because they were easily assimilable, more easily to be assimilated. But they had maybe 10 or 15% of the black kids were going to the white schools, which meant the population of black schools going down. The white schools getting a little bit more overcrowded than growth in Gloucester. And they wanted to build an addition to the white school for cafeteria facilities and so forth. It was going to cost several $100,000. And I said, no. What your problem is, you have a lot of space. Your problem is you don't use it well because you've got this segregated system. You need to go to pupil assignment. Oh, no, we're not going to do that. There's no state, no county, Virginia's done that. So I got 479 kids to transfer out of the black school into the white school, which meant the black school was virtually empty. And the white school was bursting out. It would have been overcrowded. And we did it in April when the Freedom of Choice forms came out. And we mimeographed them. You know what a mimeograph is? No, it's a duplicating device. Makes things out of ink and smells really good. We mimeographed the forms and went to all the churches, and people signed their kids up. And so then this county was represented by Edgar Pointer, who was the school board's attorney, a county attorney, commissioner of accounts, and chairman of the party. So Mr. Pointer and I got together with a guy named Flip Hicks. Flip Hicks was John DeHart, the judge's brother-in-law, and one of the smartest lawyers. He went to the Supreme Court at the age of like 24, 25, defending the Potomac River case about who owns the oysters in the Potomac River. So Flip is a really smart guy. And he and I sat down and worked out an agreement that we're not going to talk about integration, we're going to talk about quality of education, that whatever we do is going to be to make the schools better. And integration will be a byproduct, but it will be something that everybody can live with. In order to do that, we had to build about 25 classrooms at Body Top. And those classrooms are still there. The Body Top addition is the low buildings. We built them all in one summer. It cost about $500,000, which was equivalent to $5 million now. And in order to get the money, we had to get the Bank of Gloucester. Edgar Pointer was on the board of the Bank of Gloucester. To advance the funds to do it as soon as school closed. We were supposed to wait for an appropriation from the Literary Fund, which would come June the 1st, or July the 1st, because of legislation. But the bank, actually, the Confederate Bank of Gloucester actually advanced us the funds to get this thing started. And the county got together behind it, and we built these schools over the summer. When we opened the schools in the fall, we had to modernize the T.C. Walker School because we had to get all that junk they put in there, put in nice things there. And when we opened in the fall, only 70 kids left the system. Many of them came from Guinea, but they had to go all the way up to Shackleford's Fork, all the way up to King Queen to go where the sawmill is now. That was the white school. So so it worked out well, and there was no demonstrations, there was no lawsuits, and we did it before anybody else in Virginia did it. There were other places. The guy made a movie about Arlington where the high school football team had been integrated and all it. Man, none of that mess. It was as smooth as silk. So the sheriff, who saw it, said, this guy's okay, asked me if I'd be a deputy. Now, they had two deputies in the sheriff, so I became deputy number 3 or car number 4. And my father said, okay, the way it's done is you have to ask the employer if you can hire his boy. The South is still the South. So he came by and asked my dad, and my dad said, come over, would you like to do it? And I said, yeah, I could do that. So they gave me a car, 3 uniforms, $3,950 a year to be a sheriff. It's a 24/7 job. It means you do anything else you do until the phone rings. And so I was the first deputy sheriff because of the success in doing the school thing. And I had a ball. The first thing I did was I went down to Guinea and began to sit on the porch. Roland Smith was the sheriff who hired me, and he's a Guinea boy anyway. We'd go and sit on the steps of the stores down there. They had 3 major stores. And people would come by to see this new sheriff. Oh, I understand you're the sheriff. Yeah, okay, I hope you have a good time. Don't let nothing bad happen to you. They speak a non-rhetoric language, right? And it's very much like Cornish language. So I got to know them, and I actually had them arresting themselves. The first one I had to arrest, a guy named Howard Smith, had a brother named Roy Jean. The Smiths were very bad boys. They're not bad because of the Smith side of the family. Tucker Smith, their father, he worked for Raven Shackelford, and he'd go out with a truck, come back with $25,000, $30,000 on a roll. He was absolutely trustworthy. But his mother was a Hall, and I'll tell you, the Hall's a little different. They rented a house from us one time on Shelley and didn't take care of that. But anyway, these boys seemed to take care of the mother side of the family. They were just bad as they wanted to be. I put them both in the penitentiary before it was all over. But I had to arrest Howard. And I went into the bar they were hanging at. It was where the fireworks shop is at White Marsh. Now the grave building, that was the club. And I went in there. What I would do is I would always walk to the counter with the mirror so I could watch the crowd behind me. I'd talk to the guy who ran the bar. Just, and when the girl would come by with a tray to get more beer, I'd say, I need to speak to Howard Smith and tell him to come on outside and won't embarrass him in front of his friends. She goes over there and whispers in his ear. He jumps up and runs out of the building. Now I got to run all through the bar and catch him back where the foreign car place is. So I bring him back, hook him up, and they're all around my car. And Roy Jean is saying, I'm going to take my roll of jail now. So I sat in the car. I always had my gun zipped up in my jacket. That's a safe place to put it. Gun out here, anybody can get a gun in here. Only I can get it out when I got to open the zipper. And I can shoot right through the jacket if I have to. So the gun is tucked away, and these guys are trying to make a mob scene there. And so Roy Jean said, I'll take a roll of jail now. And I said, well, Roy Jean, here's how it works. I have a warrant for your brother. I assume he's innocent because he's innocent until he's proven guilty. I don't want to put him in jail. If I put him in jail in Yorktown, he wouldn't have a jail in Boston. He'd have enough crime for that. So if I put him in jail in Yorktown, I got to go back and get him next Wednesday. He's got to sit around jail for 4 or 5 days. Why don't you do this? I'll take him up to the courthouse, to the sheriff's office, and I'll wait there for you to go get Tucker. Tucker's a responsible person. He has enough money to pay the bond fee, which is like $3. And you bring him on up there, and I'll wait for you. Hey, I'll put him in jail now. You don't take him in jail now. I said, no, Roy Jean, this is the way it works. If you want to make an issue of his arrest, the sheriff is right down the street. The other deputies are standing by. State police would be glad to come, and if necessary, we get the National Guard. We don't need this, okay? Nobody needs this. What you need to do is go get your daddy, and I will wait for him. I promise you, I'm not going to put him in jail. Well, an hour or so later, he comes up with Tucker, and he goes home. Well, after that, whenever I had a warrant, I'd tell somebody, got a warrant for you. I understand you've been fighting with your cousin Billy. Well, I'm not going to serve it on you right now. If I serve it on you right now, you have to go to jail, postpone, all that kind of stuff. But if you'll be on Irving Jenkins' front porch, Irving Jenkins was the justice of peace for all the Guinea people. His house is right beside Tide Mill Bridge. And he'll go on Irving's on Friday, be there at 7 o'clock. He's eating dinner, so don't come early. Just sit on the porch. 7 o'clock, I'll come and I'll serve the papers there. Bring your mother or some landowner or your cousin, somebody's got some land, and $3, you'll be able to post a bond and go home. These are misdemeanor warrants. Nobody goes to jail if they got somebody who will stand for them. So be there at 7 o'clock. I'd get there at 7 o'clock, and I'd have 6 or 8 people waiting to be arrested. I didn't have to go get them or anything. Irving loved this because he got $3 from each of them, which you didn't have to wait around, in the middle of the night and sign one at a time. You could 6 or 7 at one time. It's free money. So then I'd make them wait on the porch until all of them had been served. Then I'd go to Billy and I'd say, I understand you and Bob had a fight. Now, I've got both of y'all, I've got these warrants. Now, if you don't want to charge him and he doesn't want to charge you, I can take these back to the court and tell them that neither party wishes to prosecute the case. And if the judge hadn't seen your name on a lot of warrants, he'll say, forget it, all right? And if not, I'll come back and let you know. Carter, a clever old fellow, take badge distinction. Billy Rock, good old boy, I'd known him since I was a child, but it wasn't him. It was that damn beer. And that was the attitude they had. And so I was really successful. Sure, I had a good time doing it. I did it for 4 or 5 years until I began to make a lot of money in real estate. Nobody wants to see a sheriff make a lot of money because that's really suspicious. So I turned it over to my cousin, who got himself arrested, but that's another story. He ran against the sheriff. He ran against the sheriff. He had a dispute with his wife. The sheriff put him in jail in the middle of the election for spousal abuse, and that was the end of the election. But I told him not to run against the sheriff. Leave the guy alone. Let him die in office. Then you can run for, But anyway, I was having fun doing that. After I had this call to the gospel, I began to be a deacon in the church in Williamsburg and came down here and joined this church right down the street. And I told the pastor I wanted to be ordained. And after about 4 or 5 years, the pastors of other churches said, we're going to ordain him if you don't. And so my pastor consented, and I was ordained. And then for 4 or 5 years later, I was called to the Shepherdsville church meeting. My mother had been a member of that church because they were really bright people, and she enjoyed talking to them. And so they asked me to speak a couple of times. After I spoke a couple of times, they had a church meeting between me and some other guy whose church was bigger than our choir. I mean, his choir was bigger than our church. But anyway, this guy had retired, and they had to choose between this experienced guy and this young kid. And I got every single vote in a Baptist church meeting. That is a miraculous as a burning bush. That just doesn't happen. This is a Baptist church. There's always somebody who's going to be there. But that worked out very well. And I've been there now for 15 years. Just had my anniversary. It's a tiny little church, but I just built a nice big addition to it so we'd have a nice place to have social events and things. And I've had fun doing it. And I'm known as a preacher who does not preach foolishness. That's the only way I can say it. The 13 churches elected me to be their institute advisor. They have a board meeting on Saturday before the 5th Sunday church service, and they talk about the business of the organization and so forth. They give money to the boys club, and they sponsor this and that, and they try to agree on, But mostly, I give them a lecture on a lot about parliamentary procedure, because parliamentary procedure was invented for Black Baptist church meetings. Henry Robert, his name is, there's no S on it. Henry Robert was a railroad engineer, not the kind who drives the train, but the guy who does the surveying. So he'd be out miles in front of the Trans-Pacific Railroad in these little Kansas towns and places, and these Protestants would be fighting in church. They would have church meetings you wouldn't believe. Well, I would believe, because I've seen some. But anyway, they would become violent. And so he went back and got the rules of the House of Representatives, which are pretty much the best rules you can get for parliamentary stuff. And he began to publish them and give them out to these little churches so they wouldn't be shooting each other. And it became very popular, so he published it as Robert's Rules. But they were written for Baptist church meetings. If you follow the rules, you make the kind of decisions that in a Congregationalist church, the will of the majority of the church, properly arrived at, is the will of God, by definition. We're all saved people. We all have equal standing before God. So if most of us agree it's the right thing to do, it's the will of God for the church. And if we make a mistake, we can fix it. We can have another vote. If the pastor is God himself, and there's somebody who can say, no, we're not going to change, then you can't solve the problem. And I've convinced them to do this. Last 5th Sunday on Saturday, they asked me to speak to the Sunday school. And of course, the DOMA rulers had come down, and I explained it this way. If I take your car keys, you can sue me because you've lost something. But the judge ruled that the plaintiffs from California did not have standing to sue because they could not articulate what it was they lost. If two guys down the street love each other, what have you lost? And when they couldn't articulate any losses, they didn't have standing to sue. That's because we're going to have to learn to let people reach their own conclusions. Now, we have a song we sing in a Baptist church, nothing between my soul and my Savior. The decisions that you make as a child of God are not really subject to anybody except the Lord. And if these people, many of whom are your brothers and cousins and so forth, want to live the way they want to live, I think we'd be badly advised to do anything about it. And I have a sermon I talked to my church about 2 weeks before that, before the court ruled, about the Good Samaritan. The young man is beat up, they rip his clothes off and leave him for dead. Church people come by, and the first guy is a priest. He won't go near him, because if he touches him and he dies, he's got to go back and get cleaned up and can't come to church. The second guy's a Levite, same reason. He doesn't check his pulse. He goes on by. Along comes a Samaritan. We don't have anything to do with Jews anyway, but he picks him up and takes him to the inn and says, I'll pay for him. I said, suppose, I told him about the Stonewall riots, where the police not only participated, they encouraged other people to beat on these people. There would be people on the street whose clothes had been ripped off because there was a transvestite bar. They would rip their clothes off, who had been beaten and left for dead. Would you stop your car and put this queer in your car, queen in your car, and take him to the hospital, which is what the Samaritan did? Or would you drive by and say he probably serves him right for being queer? And I told them that we're going to have to rethink our position, especially the black church, because I have preachers in my association. While the wives were meeting in one room, we're sitting around talking at the table. I told them how I felt about it, and they said, "Carter, I'd love you to come to my church and talk about homophobia because we have a terrible problem with it, but I'm afraid I'll lose my position." Which is what the Pharisees said about Jesus. We'll lose our place and our position if we let this guy keep on preaching. So anyway, it's been accepted because of me, I guess. You know, how should we feel? That's the kind of thing you try to do as the institute advisor. What should we do? How should we feel? And it's like being a bishop, except you have no power, except the power of persuasion. And I've enjoyed doing that, and I've been doing that now for 5 or 6 years. They pay me $75 to come in and talk. And it's a little budget because we raise a little money every year. And that's been fun. This building that I'm in here now is a gift from God. Oh, it's back to the burning bush. Okay. We developed some property in Gloucester, down in Cavahosie, that had belonged to the Price family. They wanted $220,000 to buy it. This was 30 years ago or more. That's a lot of money. And so I flew out to Memphis and met with Dr. Price, who was managing a TV station. And I made a deal with him to pay his family $200,000, but there's no commissions, no nothing. I'll just buy it. And he said yes. So I gave him $5,000 down and came back to Gloucester. And the deal was we would divide the property up into 9 portions. It was 45 acres, 46 acres, and there were 5-acre rule. And then each portion would be assigned a release value, which was 10% more than its value as a portion of the land. And if we sold a piece, we would give Mr. Price his portion plus 10%, and it would keep the difference with no personal liability. We go back to Gloucester, and Edgar Pointer is representing Dr. Price. He says, "I'm going to let him sign this contract because you don't have any personal liability." I said, "Look, if they and I agree that I pay top dollar, it's my deal at your price, or it's your price at my deal. If you want me to give you that land, we're not going to take personal liability, because suppose we're wrong. Suppose it's not worth it. Why should I lose my home? The worst that would happen is you'd get all your land back, and any portion that you sold, you'd get 10% more than you agreed to, more than the stated value, agreed upon value. So there's no way you can lose. And we just go home and wash the deal out. Oh, no, I'm not going to sign. Well, Jimmy Carter was president. Nobody bought anything anyway. Terrible time to be in business. So I let the thing ride for several years until I finally had a buyer. And coincidentally, Mr. Pointer threatened to file suit. Dr. Price came up to talk to us all, and Mr. Pointer threatened that if I didn't sign this thing, he was going to take me across the street and fund the suit himself. He said that in front of my wife and Fred Jacobs and his girlfriend and his secretary. That's called champion masoness. You cannot, as a lawyer, offer to fund somebody else's lawsuit. You just can't do that. It's against the rules. But he said it, and I said, well, since you said it that way, I'm going to sign the deal. Because if it goes wrong, you will hear those words again. We get down to the last piece, and I had to sue him a couple of times. I had to take him before Judge Armstead and make him give me some land. He didn't want to release. He wanted more. I screwed him good. The last piece of land was $75,000. We got 3 partners, me, Jacobs, and his cousins, the Islands, who all went to the camps together, these old guys. Great guys. I can't even find the contract. Nobody's ever looked at the contract since we made it. And the last part, my share was $25,000 coming in at 11%. 11.5%. So I wanted to find some land. I wanted to buy something with it, because that's what I do. And I asked Herb Sandler of Talking Realty, is there anything in Denver which has grown 150% in 10 years? I want a piece of commercial property. He came back right away, said, this piece of land on Rich Neck Road, but the building was on it. It's fallen down on the foundation, and nobody will buy it, and the bank only wants what they've got into it. Guess how much the bank wanted? $25,000. Exactly $25,000. And they only want 10.5%. So I had the rich guy who was buying the land from me pay the bank. Well, 5 years later, the banks paid off the land. I found out the foundation was plumb level and square. The bricks that were on top of the foundation was because the first guy who built the foundation was a German engineer, which is why it's plumb level and square. It's a 4-foot crawl space, or 20-foot driven pilings down here because it's plastic clay. Magnificent foundation. He dies. A professional engineer and a dentist buy the building. They want to put up an office, but they want the office to have glass brick corners and glass corners and so forth. So they put up the bricks first, but they didn't have any corners. Wind came along before they could tie it all together, blew it all down. They went broke. leaving the bank holding the bag for the original purchase price. But the foundation's here. It's plumb level and square. All I had to do was clean it off and design a building that would fit. Well, it's 45 by 90. It's perfect, you know. So I talked to Flip. He said we could put a auto parts, used car, diagnostic, because there's all these cars around here. But Fred, if you don't know anything about his funeral service, do you think you put a funeral home here? Well, it's 15 miles from Waynesburg. It's 15 miles from the East End. There's no other black folks around. This sounds like a good place to have a funeral home, since we already had equipment and stuff in the other funeral homes. I didn't have to go out and buy hearses and things. So I designed this building. I got an architect to sort of look at it and sign off, and he used some drawings so I could get downtown with it. But after that, we basically threw the design away and built what I wanted to build. This building has got solar heat, and it's got the slab here heats out under the other slab. It never doesn't freeze in the wintertime and all this kind of stuff. So I went to the bank and I said, I want to put a funeral home. No, a fellow came down from Williamsburg because we had saved the Bruton Heights school from being destroyed. I was like, save Bruton Heights, that was me. And this guy was a member of the school board, and he years later, he's now on the VOTEC board, which is Williamsburg, Hampton, Newport News, Pocosin, and all the schools in James City County, all together had this VOTEC school right up here by the church. We have another one down on the other end. And he was on that board, coincidentally, providentially. And he says, we got a foundation here, and it's June. If you can get us a plan together, I bet you I can get the kids to build your building as a project. They're right up the street, and they're taking building trades. And the building trades guy said, sure, it sounds like fun to me, because they're in the building, with saw benches and making little stick things, and they would fix somebody's porch. But this was a real project, take them all year. So I said, okay, I showed them the plan, and they said they would put the building up for $3,500. So then I designed the second floor with the windows and everything, that you see up there. And they said, well, okay, to do that, we'll charge you $4,500. $4,500. So I said, sure. I went to the bank, and they said, well, you want to put a funeral home? I said, yeah. He says, well, land's been paid off, never missed a payment. How much would you like to have? Now, people say black people can't get money from the bank. You go to the bank with a reasonable deal. Hell, the banks that make money, they're not concerned about your race. So they said, how much would you like to have? I said, I don't know. I think I'd probably put it up for $150,000. It was going to be worth $300,000 or more. But there was no construction cost. I mean, what's $4,500? And it turns out I could buy all the materials and a lot of pizza, and it turned out like to be $120,000 that I actually put up this building with, having finished the interior and everything. And I had $30,000 left with which to carry the business as we started in a new location. So I didn't have to put any money in this deal from the time I sold that land, which I got from Mr. Price for $5,000 down, had already made $500,000 on the other portions. This was a gift from God. There's no way you could providentially find the bank wanted $25,000 just when you got $25,000, and they want 10% just when you got 11%. And we started out here with a clean deck, and so that's why, if anybody asks, my life is a gift from God. I love what I do. I do my own embalming. Nobody does the embalming but me. And we have a reputation for doing very good work. Now, we're not the chiefest funeral home in town, so we don't have a huge volume. But we do really good work for people who appreciate it, especially military folks, because they love a parade. They want it done right, and our people dress right. They have uniform black suits with uniform ties, and they wear the government issue shiny shoes that are waterproof. Great shoes. And one of the guys who works for me, Julius Green, was the second Army diver, like the guy in the movie. Another guy, John Murdoch, was the only person to fly jets off his carrier. He went to Pensacola as a white hat sailor because he had failed out of college, went down there, talked his way into Pensacola, and talked his way not into flying tankers and stuff, but into flying jets. And he landed on carriers at night. This is a skill that nobody can do. I fly little planes. Movies, that's my idea of an airplane. I just sold an airplane, but I flew it for 15 years. But John could land this thing anywhere. Well, he caught hell. He caught hell from the MPs or the shore patrol. He caught hell from the Marines on the boat. He caught hell from the other officers. He could never get a decent efficiency rating because he was the only black pilot on the boat. So he got shot down over Vietnam, and he was in the in the rice paddy holding his friend up like John McCain until somebody got him and they had a firefight and he got rescued. Another time his plane went down at sea. You know, it's really great people. And that we get these really nice people who work for us. And we're going to have a birthday party in about half an hour for one of our people.
Okay, well that gives me a chance to. I just need to ask you real quick about the gas station. If you're running out of time, just tell me what you know.
The thing I remember about the Texaco gas station was that they had white gas. We had a boat. We always had a boat. We used to take Marshall and these guys out on the boat, go fishing. It was like charter. And we had a gas stove on it, gasoline stove, the camp stove, and it burned white gas. And even though the Texaco gas is a little more expensive than anybody's else, it was clear. It didn't have any dyes and stuff. I know. You go ahead on. I'll be there in time. If you want to pick up some whatever it is, go ahead. So, my friend Larimore, bought the car wash. Well, he was deputy sheriff, the third black deputy sheriff, and I made the job possible. And Pudgy knows how to act. George knows how to act. He's a gentleman's gentleman, and he came from Zion Poplar's Church, and Zion Poplar's Church is related to Ware Church, so he had a lot of support from the conservative white community. And he stayed on until he finally retired. He was like a lieutenant or something. He made a project out of being the deputy sheriff. And I remember when he bought it that they were trying to figure out how to breathe some life into the building, because it really is an artifact of Gloucester Courthouse, and we're running out of artifacts. And so it's a very good idea to preserve it. And it was a place where you could, if you go to Matthews, you get gas, and people would come up and do it. But the thing about the Texaco gas was it was pure. It was didn't have any impurities, and you could use it for. A lot of people had stoves and things that burned their gas, and that was why we went there. It was on the way to the boat. The boat was at Warehouse Landing, so we stopped by there and put 5 gallons in a can. It was on the way down the street there. We buy gas for that, but it was like a centerpiece of the courthouse.
Do you remember Captain Jack Brown or Andy James?
Brown was the owner. They had a franchise. They brought the gas in from Wernick, and I can remember the tanker leaked. When the tanker would come off the Ware River, we had our boat in the Ware River, and it would go by, it would be a sheen on the water as it went up there. Oh, nothing, gasoline, don't evaporate. And so the Browns Wharf was where they unloaded the gas, so they distributed oil and gas all over from there. But I remember the boat, chug. It was a very small tanker because it only like 15 feet of water in the river, so you couldn't go. But it was the kind of thing you could go from little place here to little place there. And they had the fuel oil franchise. The other guys were at the Bowditches had the gas from the other pipeline at Yorktown. So Bowditch made money doing that before they went to car business. But they were the competitors. They had gas that was red.
Mm-hmm. Did people ever socialize at the gas station?
It wasn't a hangout. For a place that's kind of small too. It didn't have a big porch. They had a drive-through. People kept running into it, but they had a drive-through. You get gas on either side. But it wasn't so much a hangout. The people who, I guess, Brown's friends knew, but the hangout was up at Morgan's Drugstore. Morgan's Drugstore was next to the bank at the time, and across the street from the Union Bank, the National Bank. See, the Confederate Bank. Bank of Gloucester was Confederate Bank. Across the street was the National Bank, which was the Union Bank. And the Gloucester Land Building Loan had money in the Union Bank when things crashed. So my grandfather never trusted banks after that. That's why he had the money in the north room of the house. But that was, in front of Morgan's Drugstore, there was a wall. And people who were looking for temporary employment, much like your Hispanic people sort of assemble around Home Depot, people who didn't have anything to do would sit on that wall and wait for somebody to give them a job, or they just socialize. This is where the black folks are. It was called a buzzard's roost, because all these black people were sitting on the road, and everybody agreed it was a buzzard's roost. T.C. Walker would go by, and he'd say, his favorite word was nigger. Y'all niggas get to work. Y'all need to get to work. What y'all doing out here? You save your money and work, you'd have something. He would cuss about every time he went by. He was not patient with the buzzard's roost. But that was the sort of the hangout in the middle of the community for most of the black people who were unemployed. But they didn't socialize so much at the gas station.
Right. as far as the rest of Main Street goes, did you notice any, I mean, obviously it's segregated, but I'm kind of...
It wasn't thoroughly segregated. Dr. Morgan was Harvey's father, and Harvey and his brother worked there, as long as their wives. You go there, because I went there one May Day, it's 1962, or no, 1959, because I graduated in 1961. And I went with my cousins, pretty little girls, and at May Day they would have a big celebration at school, everybody take a half day off, and the girls were in their cheerleader outfits. And I had a nice car. I've always bought us the nicest car in school, better than teachers' cars. And we drove them up to the courthouse. We're going to go and sit in at Harvey Morgan's drugstore. So we walk in, Helen Hodges, Marlene Green, Brenda Carey, and myself. And we sat at the counter. And the lady behind the counter looked over. I claimed it was Harvey. He said it might have been his brother, but he was running for office, so I said it was Harvey. And Harvey just looked at him and nodded. Go ahead and serve him. And so we were served. Gray's drugstore was across the street. You couldn't get anything out of there. I mean, that was strictly segregated. You couldn't have anything to eat or anything like that. So they were in competition. But Dr. Turner's people and all the black folks that we can influence went to Morgan's drugstore because they were decent people. And they did this long before they had to do it. Okay. But at Gray's drugstore, they had a black doctor. Dr. Turner was the black doctor who had a nice diathermy thing in a big basement. He had waiting rooms and he had equipment and stuff and a lovely home, which is still in Gloucester. Dr. Morris was the other black doctor, who's a local guy, and I don't know how he got his degree, but he had the less affluent or the less intelligent black folks. And he would not only send them to Gray's drugstore, he would leave his little office and walk to Gray's. His office was on the circle. One of those little buildings on the circle there. He would walk from there to Gray's drugstore, buy the drugs, take them back, and sell them to his people while he sat there and waited. And he had an office that didn't have running water, a doctor's office. And by the end of the day, it smelled like it didn't have running water. It was terrible. But there were people sitting there when Dr. Turner didn't have clients because he was. I don't know, somehow ignorance is no obstacle to success. And so, but he was a patron of the Gray's drugstore, but Dr. Turner, like Godfather, who was West Indian, so he wasn't one of the community, right? He was the second West Indian doctor. The one before that was a guy named Dr. Boval, who was also an excellent smart doctor, but Dr. Morris was right there chipping along, and people dying like flies, but anyway, that was his job. So the circle was, almost all the way on the circle was black. Starting at the corner, where there's nothing there, was a hotel, a black hotel, and there's a little road that goes into the back, there's a back motel back there, and then the big house next to that belonged to Harry Watkins, that was a black house, and Mars was the building next to that. Then on the other corner, next to the lodge hall, there was a building that at one time was a shoe repair place, and when it belonged to to Waldron Stokes, who had, he was Dr. Stokes's, who belonged to Dr. Stokes was another black doctor who was well reputed, okay? So his son, Waldron, was a ne'er-do-well, spoiled rotten by being the doctor's son. He goes down to Tuskegee because his father's friends with the Prices and the Pattersons and all those people. He gets down there with a big Oldsmobile or something, Cadillac, and he's taking trips, and his boys driving from New Orleans to Chicago to the Morehouse. So actually, he took about a year before he failed out of Tuskegee. He comes back home and he says he wants to go into the beer business because they didn't have a beer hall. Well, T.C. Walker didn't believe in beer, so there was not going to be no beer hall in Gloucester. But he owned this building right there across the street from the courthouse, right on the corner, right beside the jail, across the street from exactly where the jail is now, right this empty lot there. There was a building there that he owned. So he said he wanted to put a beer garden there. And of course, it had to come before the city council and county supervisors. And they were not about to allow it. But Dr. Stokes said, I kept a record of every abortion I've ever performed. And they passed it. Because they wouldn't send their daughters to the white doctors because they played bridge and all of that. So if you had an abortion, you'd call Dr. Stokes or somebody, Dr. Turner or somebody, and they would do the abortion. So he had a record of everybody he had aborted, and of course they were all aborted supervised. They were their children, so they decided the best way to have what he wanted. And he was there for years until he moved it down to where they next to the high school, the spot to buy the building, which you see sort of falling apart there now. But that was his beer garden. And then Leon Gregory had the beer garden down there, down at Hayes' store, Ordinary. He had a beer garden called the Wagon Wheel. We used to have great shows there. We saw everybody there. James Brown, the Stylistics, everybody, Fats Domino, I mean, everybody who was on the chicken circuit, we saw them all. He built a movie theater across the street called the Hub Theater, the Wagon Wheel Restaurant, the Hub Theater. And it was a nice theater. It was better than the White Theater, which we had to sit down the hill in a frame building until the reels went up there. Then they'd bring the reel down and start the movie down the hill and all this kind of stuff at Edge Hill. So we always went down to to his theater. Then he had the Rim Theater. The Hub was the dry cleaning business. He was really quite an entrepreneur. In the back, he had a ball field. He was one of the Negro League sponsors. And he was quite a guy. Yeah, he was an interesting person. And then he had a nursery. He made that corner into a really successful little operation. But that's where we went for recreation in those days. We'd go down to the theater and spend the day and go to his place. Well, when the Ku Klux Klan wanted to come to Gloucester, they advertised all over the county they're going to have a hearing down in Guinea, have a rally down in Guinea, this field. What they didn't know was the Gregories owned the land on the other side of the road going into the field. So you have this big open field, the road down to the middle. The Klan was going to rent the piece on this side, but all this land on this side, all the way down to the river, Tide Mill, belongs to the Gregory family. So Walter Stokes and Leon Gregory decided the night of the Klan rally, they organized a bring any kind of weapon turkey shoot. No turkeys, no targets, just bring the gun. And all the black folks showed up on the field on the other side from where they're trying to have this Klan rally. Roland Smith was there. Roland Smith knew how to get elected. He was not going to get elected by going against his people, so he and the state police were aligning the road. Well, you can tell which side they're on by which way they were facing. They were facing the Klan. They had their backs to the black group with all these shotguns and rifles and things because they were expecting trouble to come to the other side of the road. And so the Klan rally began before dark, and there's this mob of black folks with guns here standing around watching, and the Klan's trying to have their rally. Well, Gregory had a sister who lived at the end of the road, and she was known to have a drink or two, and she's Mary Randall's mother, the historian Mary Randall, school teacher, who was Miss Guinea one year. She was the thing of the Guinea parade. She was the Grand Marshal, this black girl. Well, anyway, Mary's mother went down there, and they were beginning their rally. They had a flatbed truck with some speakers and things on it, and they had their Klan stuff on a little 2x4 cross. Walter and Leon took a telephone pole and made a real cross. This sucker was 20 feet tall. It was wrapped in burlap. It just was a gorgeous cross. Stuck it in the ground. And as the rally began, she got tired of hearing that nigger stuff, so she walked across through the sea of white hoods, which opened like the Red Sea, because behind her, guns are going ka-ching. She walked up to the stand, pulled the man's microphone and speakers down, threw them on the ground, and then walked away. So the Klan rally was not exactly successful, and they decided to light the cross. It wasn't quite dark. They lit their little cross. And when they lit their little cross and started packing up, the black folks lit this monstrous cross, a beautiful night. And the Starks, they always huge, they lit up the whole area. They said, "Wish you what a cross those looked like." Well, the Klan was overheard as they were leaving, saying, "We're not coming back to Gloucester because there's too many niggers and too many nigger lovers," because the Guinea men over there with black folks. They had lived together all these years. They had harvested fish and stuff together. If your boat was sinking, they'd come help you, and vice versa. And so they were always on the side with us, as opposed to these foreigners who'd come in here to cause this trouble. And they never came back. Now they have their rally at the York County Library. And the last time they did that, they shut down traffic on Route 17. I mean, the police had going around the wrong side of it. It just made a mess of it. But that's the way they handle stuff. So Gloucester is the only black community that ran everybody out of town. Gloucester is the first community, 1663, that had a slave rebellion. The Indentured and Slave Rebellion in 1663. They were also the home base for Bacon, Nathaniel Bacon. There's a plaque in the old courthouse describing him as the son of Gloucester. In each case, there were as many black as white slaves. See, indentured was slavery, there was no difference. And there were just as many white slaves as there were black slaves in both revolts. And when Bacon raised about somewhere between 500 and 1,000 people, and when he burned Jamestown and ran Governor Berkeley out of town, but he got sick and died, and the thing fell apart. The last 200 people who surrendered were black. Gloucester's always been a place where black folks and white folks have gotten along. It's always been a hotbed of basically liberal causes. And it's a great county, and it's not the kind of county that's described as being a bunch of redneck crazies. The redneck crazy Tea Party crowd, they come from Newport News. They didn't come from Gloucester. The people in Gloucester don't subscribe to that. My daughter's chairman of the Democratic Party there, and she got 45% of the vote in what's supposed to be a Republican area in the last election. So it's a really great place to be. It's a good place to be from. And it's a level place. Williamsburg always had very rich people and then all these poor people. Whether they were black or white didn't make a bit of difference. An indentured served, 1660, they changed the rules, so you stayed indentured. Mm-hmm. And in 1663, they had a revolt because they were sick of it. When they got together in 1678, whatever it was, the Bacon's Rebellion, that's when the powers that be, the governor and his crew, decided they had to do something about the cooperation between the black slaves and the white slaves, the indentures. And they made new rules that the blacks would always be black, and that the indentures, though they had no rights, they had a little bit more power than the blacks. And they said it in their documents as they debated it. If we can give the white poor a little bit more privilege than the black poor, they will keep the black poor down for us. All we have to do is divide and rule. That has been the operative principle of conservative government in the United States ever since. And right now it's expressed in the Tea Party, which has exactly the same principles. If we can, the Koch brothers and people like that say, if we can fund people to say silly stuff, we will be able to divide the blacks from the working poor. Mm-hmm. And that way we'll be able to keep them, they will keep them down for us. And that's the principle that goes on now. But Gloucester didn't run that way. Gloucester was always, we didn't have a hotel in Gloucester until I was 40. They didn't have but they only had like 25 pieces of Gloucester with over 200 acres. Gloucester was settled by little farm owners because they took the land from the Indians, and you couldn't take but so much. There are a couple of land grants like White Marsh and down by the Ware River, but most of the land was sort of, we take it and then we keep it. And then Bacon said you ought to fight for it and all of that. So you have all these little parcels of land, and it was a majority black county up until maybe 1930, before people went off to the war. And so black folks to this day own more than their share of land. And the Ford Foundation, Ford Foundation came down in the 1950s to see why there was no sharecroppers and no rental properties, only 20 pieces of property per rent in Gloucester, because of the Gloucester and Building and Loan. Gloucester Land Building and Loan, it financed everybody wanted his own home.